In 2006, South Park declared war on Family Guy, calling its writers a tank of manatees randomly picking jokes out of a hat. Seth MacFarlane himself called the attack funny and accurate. Nearly 20 years later, everything Trey Parker and Matt Stone predicted about Family Guy came true, and then some. This is the full story of animation's greatest feud, and why history proved South Park right. Let's get into it. Now, to understand why South Park went after Family Guy the way they did, you need to understand what was happening in the world of adult animation during the mid-2000s. Because this wasn't just two shows having a disagreement about comedy. This was a fundamental clash between two completely different philosophies about what animated television should be, how jokes should work, and what comedy owes its audience. And the stakes were higher than most people realize, because the outcome of this creative war would shape the direction of adult animation for the next 2 decades. It would influence which shows got greenlit, which comedic styles were considered legitimate, and what audiences came to expect from their entertainment. The reverberations are still being felt today, and they go far beyond the animation industry into questions about how all comedy functions in the age of social media and algorithmic content delivery. Let's set the stage. By 2005, the landscape of adult animated television was dominated by 3 major players. The Simpsons had been the undisputed king since 1989, establishing the template for what a primetime animated comedy could look like. South Park had arrived in 1997 with its deliberately crude animation and razor-sharp social commentary, proving that you didn't need smooth artwork to deliver devastating satire. And then there was Family Guy, which had one of the strangest journeys in television history. Seth MacFarlane created Family Guy in 1999, and the show ran for 3 seasons before Fox cancelled it in 2002 due to low ratings. But here's where things get interesting. During those years off the air, Family Guy found a massive audience through DVD sales and reruns on Cartoon Network's Adult Swim programming block. The reruns consistently pulled strong ratings, and the DVD sold millions of copies. Fox took notice and made the unprecedented decision to bring Family Guy back from cancellation in 2005, making it one of the very few shows in television history to be revived after being axed. When Family Guy returned, it came back bigger than ever. The show was pulling in massive ratings and generating incredible buzz. MacFarlane was being treated like a comedy genius, and the show's signature style of rapid-fire cutaway gags was being celebrated as a revolutionary approach to animated comedy. Clips of Family Guy cutaways were going viral on the still-new YouTube platform, introducing the show to audiences who had never watched a full episode. The cutaway format was perfectly suited for internet sharing because each gag was self-contained and didn't require any context from the larger episode to be funny. You could pull any random 30-second clip from Family Guy, post it online, and people would laugh without knowing anything about the characters or the story. Think about what this meant for the entire television industry. A show that had been cancelled, that a major network had given up on, was now pulling bigger numbers than shows that had never gone off the air. Family Guy's resurrection story became one of the most studied cases in television history, and the lesson that network executives took from it was that audiences wanted fast, disposable, easily shareable humor above all else. The clips didn't need context. The gags didn't need setup. You could consume Family Guy in 15-second bursts on an early-generation smartphone and get the same experience you'd get watching a full episode on your couch. That was revolutionary in 2005, and it made every other show look slow and outdated by comparison. This was a massive deal for the animation industry because it suggested that the future of comedy might lie in disconnected, bite-sized gags rather than cohesive storytelling. Networks were watching Family Guy's success with dollar signs in their eyes, thinking about how to replicate that formula. MacFarlane himself was given the green light to create 2 additional shows, American Dad in 2005 and The Cleveland Show in 2009, effectively turning him into a one-man animation empire at Fox. But not everyone in the animation world was celebrating. Behind the scenes, there was a growing resentment toward Family Guy from the writers' rooms of other animated shows. The complaint was simple but profound. Family Guy was being celebrated and rewarded for what many professional comedy writers considered lazy, undisciplined work. The cutaway gags that made the show famous were, in the eyes of these critics, a shortcut that avoided the hard work of crafting jokes that grew organically from character and story. You didn't need to know who Peter Griffin was as a person to laugh at a cutaway about him fighting a chicken. You didn't need to understand the family dynamics to enjoy a random flashback to a celebrity doing something absurd. The jokes existed in a vacuum, completely disconnected from anything resembling emotional investment or narrative consequence. This might sound like jealousy, and to some extent, maybe it was. Family Guy was making enormous amounts of money with a formula that seemed effortless compared to the painstaking story construction that shows like South Park and The Simpsons employed. But the concern went deeper than professional rivalry. Comedy writers who had spent their careers learning how to build jokes that served a story, that revealed character, that paid off setups from earlier in an episode, were watching as the industry began to reward the opposite approach. If cutaway gags were the future, then everything they had learned about comedy writing was becoming obsolete. The Simpsons writers were particularly bothered because they felt that Family Guy was essentially a knockoff of their show, just with the storytelling stripped out and replaced with random pop culture references. The Simpsons had always used pop culture references, but they were woven into the fabric of their stories. When Homer referenced a movie or a celebrity, it was because that reference illuminated something about his character or advanced the plot. Family Guy's references, by contrast, seemed to exist purely for the sake of recognition humor. Hey, remember this thing from the 1980s? Remember that celebrity? The audience would laugh not because the joke was clever, but because they recognized the reference and felt rewarded for their cultural knowledge. South Park occupied a unique position in this landscape because Trey Parker and Matt Stone had built their show on a completely different foundation than either The Simpsons or Family Guy. South Park episodes were produced on an incredibly tight schedule, sometimes going from concept to completion in less than a week. This breakneck production cycle meant that South Park could respond to current events with a speed that no other animated show could match. When something happened in the news on Monday, South Park could have an episode about it airing by Wednesday. This made the show feel urgent and relevant in a way that neither The Simpsons nor Family Guy could replicate, since those shows typically had production cycles of 6 to 10 months per episode. But the speed wasn't what made South Park special. What made it special was how Parker and Stone used that speed in service of actual storytelling. Every South Park episode, no matter how crude or outrageous, was built around a coherent narrative with a beginning, middle, and end. The jokes grew out of the story and the characters. When Cartman did something horrible, it was funny because you knew Cartman and understood why he would do that thing. When Kyle gave one of his moral speeches, it landed because you had watched the entire episode building toward that moment. The comedy and the story were inseparable, which is exactly the opposite of how Family Guy operated. Parker and Stone weren't quiet about their feelings toward Family Guy's comedy style. In interviews leading up to the Cartoon Wars episodes, both men had made their position clear. During a DVD commentary session, Parker said flatly that they had seen Family Guy, and they did hate it. But he qualified that statement by saying they understood why people loved it, that it could provide a simple laugh, and they didn't think it should be taken off the air. Their issue wasn't with Family Guy's existence. It was with what Family Guy represented, and more importantly, with the growing tendency of people to compare South Park and Family Guy as if they were doing the same thing. That comparison drove Parker and Stone crazy, because in their view, the two shows couldn't be more different in their creative philosophies, their relationship to storytelling, and their expectations of their audience. Being compared to Family Guy was like being a chef at a fine restaurant and having people compare your work to a microwave dinner. Both produce food. Both might taste good to certain people. But the process, the intent, and the craftsmanship are worlds apart. Parker explained that there was one thing they always tried to avoid in South Park, which was gags. Disconnected jokes that existed purely for their own sake rather than serving the story. To Parker and Stone, comedy without narrative purpose was comedy without meaning. And comedy without meaning was, in their view, not really comedy at all. It was just noise. Stone took a slightly more diplomatic approach, noting that what made him disappointed about Family Guy was that it could be an amazing show. You could tell there were smart people working on it, he said. But he felt they weren't working hard enough. This was perhaps the most cutting criticism of all, because it wasn't saying Family Guy's writers were talentless. It was saying they were squandering their talent by choosing the easy path instead of pushing themselves to create something better. Parker agreed, adding bluntly that they needed to work harder. These weren't throwaway comments made in passing. Parker and Stone were clearly building toward something, and in April 2006, they delivered it. The two-part episode Cartoon Wars would become one of the most famous and controversial episodes in South Park history, not because of its commentary on censorship and free speech, which was actually the A-plot, but because of its devastating, methodical takedown of Family Guy's creative philosophy. And the way they structured the attack was brilliant, because they didn't just mock Family Guy. They explained exactly why they believed Family Guy's approach to comedy was fundamentally flawed, and they did it through the one thing Family Guy never prioritized: storytelling. Cartoon Wars Part 1 aired on April 5, 2006, and right from the opening moments, it was clear that this was going to be something special. The episode begins with the citizens of South Park in full panic mode, which is a familiar setup for the show. But the reason for their panic is unusual. A cartoon is going to air an episode featuring the Prophet Muhammad as a character, and everyone is terrified of potential terrorist retaliation. When it's revealed that the cartoon in question is Family Guy, the episode immediately establishes its dual purpose. On one level, this is going to be about censorship, free speech, and the cowardice of self-censorship in the face of threats. On another level, it's going to be about why Family Guy is everything wrong with modern comedy. The genius of the Cartoon Wars structure is how Parker and Stone use Cartman and Kyle as stand-ins for two opposing viewpoints. Cartman, who is usually the villain, appears to be taking the moral high ground by arguing that Family Guy shouldn't be allowed to air content that offends Muslims. But as Kyle and the audience quickly discover, Cartman doesn't actually care about Muslims at all. He's exploiting the censorship controversy as a Trojan horse to achieve his real goal, getting Family Guy cancelled entirely because he hates their style of comedy. Kyle is horrified by this because despite his own feelings about the show, he understands that censoring one show opens the door to censoring everything. The conflict between them becomes a race to Hollywood, with Cartman trying to shut Family Guy down and Kyle trying to save it, creating dramatic tension that builds across both episodes. The episode includes several spot-on parodies of actual Family Guy scenes, and this is where Parker and Stone's criticism starts to cut deep. They recreate the Family Guy format with devastating accuracy, showing Peter Griffin making nonsensical non sequiturs that trigger random cutaway gags with zero connection to whatever story is supposedly happening. In one parody, Peter's wife Lois is upset about him inviting an ex-girlfriend to dinner, and Peter responds with a flashback to the time he auditioned to play Kit on Knight Rider. In another, Peter sells pancakes to Captain Kirk. The jokes are deliberately flat and random, and yet they feel exactly like real Family Guy gags. Parker and Stone aren't exaggerating for comic effect here. They're holding up a mirror and showing the audience what Family Guy's comedy looks like when you strip away the familiar voices and the comfortable living room setting. And the reflection isn't flattering. Cartman delivers the thesis statement of the entire two-parter when he screams that he is nothing like Family Guy. When he makes jokes, they are inherent to a story, he yells. Deep, situational, and emotional jokes based on what is relevant and has a point, not just one random interchangeable joke after another. This is Parker speaking through Cartman, laying out in plain language the difference between comedy that matters and comedy that's just killing time. The word interchangeable is key here, because that's the fundamental problem with cutaway gags. You could swap any Family Guy cutaway with any other cutaway and it wouldn't change the episode at all. The gags are modular, not structural. They're decoration, not architecture. Cartoon Wars Part 2 aired a week later, on April 12, 2006, and it pushed the critique even further by revealing the secret behind Family Guy's writing process. Cartman arrives at the Fox studios and discovers that Family Guy isn't written by human writers at all. Instead, the show is produced by a tank of manatees who randomly select balls with words printed on them. The balls are fed into a script generator, and whatever random combination comes up becomes the next cutaway gag. One ball says laundry. Another says date. Then in winning. Then New Mexico. Then Gary Coleman. And just like that, you have a Family Guy joke that's indistinguishable from the real thing. This is probably the single most devastating piece of media criticism ever aired on a television show. Not because it's mean-spirited, but because it's accurate in a way that everyone instantly recognized. The manatee metaphor captured something that viewers had felt but couldn't articulate. Family Guy's jokes felt random because they were random. The process of creating a cutaway gag didn't require understanding the characters, advancing a plot, or saying anything meaningful about the world. It just required combining pop culture references in novel combinations. Any combination would do, because no combination was more or less connected to the story than any other. The manatees weren't a cruel exaggeration. They were a perfect metaphor for algorithmic comedy, jokes generated through recombination rather than through insight. There's a particularly clever detail in the manatee reveal that most people miss. When Cartman tries to sabotage Family Guy by removing one of the idea balls from the tank, the manatees refuse to work. They won't produce any comedy unless all the random elements are available to them. This isn't just a joke about manatees being stubborn. It's Parker and Stone making a deeper point about the creative principle behind Family Guy. The manatees refuse to work because the show's comedy is based on the principle that everything is fair game and nothing is sacred. Remove one possible reference, one potential target, and the entire system breaks down. It's actually a surprisingly nuanced observation about how Family Guy's randomness isn't accidental. It's philosophical. The show believes that comedy works best when there are no boundaries and no structure, and that any attempt to impose limits or direction on the joke-making process is an attack on the comedy itself. This is where the two storylines of Cartoon Wars intersect brilliantly. The censorship plot about Muhammad and the creative critique of Family Guy are actually the same argument from different angles. The people trying to censor the Muhammad episode are trying to remove one ball from the tank, saying this topic is off-limits. And the manatees refuse to accept that because their entire creative philosophy depends on total randomness and total freedom. Kyle ends up defending Family Guy's right to air the Muhammad episode not because he likes the show, but because he understands that the principle of free expression is more important than the quality of any individual piece of expression. His speech to the Fox president captures this perfectly. Either everything is okay, or nothing is. You can't pick and choose which types of comedy are acceptable and which aren't. Even bad comedy, even lazy comedy, even comedy that you despise, deserves protection. It's a remarkably mature and balanced argument for a show that's simultaneously eviscerating its target. Parker and Stone managed to destroy Family Guy's creative credibility while simultaneously defending its right to exist. That's an incredible tightrope to walk, and the fact that they pulled it off is a testament to exactly the kind of disciplined, story-driven comedy that they were championing. Every joke in Cartoon Wars serves the dual narrative. Every character moment advances both the censorship theme and the creative critique. There's not a single random cutaway, not a single disconnected gag. The comedy and the argument are completely intertwined, and the result is an episode that practices what it preaches. The Cartoon Wars episodes also work as a meta-commentary on their own existence. By using a carefully constructed story to argue that carefully constructed stories are superior to random gags, South Park was essentially performing a proof by demonstration. The episodes themselves were the evidence for their own argument. If you were entertained by Cartoon Wars, if you were invested in Kyle's race against Cartman, if you cared about whether free speech would prevail, then you were experiencing exactly the kind of engagement that story-driven comedy makes possible and that gag-driven comedy can never achieve. Parker and Stone didn't just tell the audience that their approach was better. They showed them, in real time, over the course of 2 episodes, and then let the audience decide for themselves. The brilliance of Cartman's character in this storyline also deserves recognition. Having the show's most selfish, manipulative character be the one arguing against Family Guy's existence was a stroke of genius because it prevented the argument from feeling self-righteous. If Kyle had been the one trying to get Family Guy cancelled, the episodes would have felt preachy and superior. But by making it Cartman's mission, and by showing that his stated reasons were lies covering his real motivation, Parker and Stone added layers of irony and self-awareness that made the criticism land harder. Cartman doesn't want Family Guy cancelled because he has high standards for comedy. He wants it cancelled because its popularity annoys him and he sees an opportunity to exercise power. The real argument against Family Guy's creative approach comes through the episodes themselves, through the contrast between what South Park is doing and what Family Guy represents, not through any character's dialogue. That's sophisticated storytelling, and it's exactly the kind of thing that manatees can't produce. The Muhammad plotline itself became one of the most infamous episodes in television history. Parker and Stone wanted to show Muhammad in the episode to make their point about censorship, but Comedy Central refused. This corporate censorship was written directly into the storyline, resulting in a scene where the audience sees a black title card reading Comedy Central has refused to broadcast an image of Muhammad on their network instead of the actual animation. It was simultaneously a capitulation and a protest, a moment where the show's meta-commentary became indistinguishable from its reality. The irony was thick enough to cut with a knife. An episode about the dangers of self-censorship was itself being censored, proving Parker and Stone's point more effectively than any scripted scene ever could. The episode's final scene hammered this home with surgical precision. After all the debate about whether showing Muhammad would trigger violent retaliation, the episode aired with Muhammad censored. But then Al-Qaeda responded with a cartoon of their own, showing Jesus defecating on George W. Bush and the American flag. This retaliatory cartoon was shown completely uncensored. The juxtaposition was devastating. Comedy Central would censor a depiction of Muhammad out of fear, but would happily broadcast something designed to offend Christians and Americans. The message was clear: censorship isn't about sensitivity or respect. It's about fear. You can offend anyone you want as long as they don't threaten violence in response. And that's a deeply dangerous standard for a free society to accept. When Cartoon Wars aired, the reaction from the animation industry was immediate and dramatic. Parker and Stone revealed in their DVD commentary that they were contacted by the staff of The Simpsons and King of the Hill, both of whom expressed gratitude and enthusiasm for what South Park had done. Parker shared that the Simpsons staff told them they hated Family Guy more than South Park did, which is saying something given how openly Parker and Stone had expressed their disdain. The King of the Hill team was even more emphatic, reportedly telling Parker and Stone that they were doing God's work by calling out Family Guy's creative shortcomings. This wasn't just friendly industry banter. This was a genuine moment of solidarity among professional comedy writers who had been watching Family Guy's success with growing frustration and concern. Parker later described it as an animation solidarity moment where everyone in the industry came together over their shared feelings about Family Guy. The fact that writers from 3 different shows on 2 different networks could find common ground in their criticism of a 4th show speaks volumes about how widespread the concern was. This wasn't one jealous competitor taking a cheap shot. This was an entire professional community nodding in agreement and saying, "Finally, someone said it." The solidarity had creative consequences too. Parker and Stone incorporated the industry reaction into Cartoon Wars Part 2 itself. When Cartman arrives at the Fox studios trying to get Family Guy cancelled, he encounters a kid who looks suspiciously like Bart Simpson, sitting in the same waiting room with the same goal. This was a direct reference to The Simpsons reaching out to South Park, and it served as a knowing wink to the audience that the criticism of Family Guy wasn't coming from one direction. It was coming from everywhere. The inclusion of a King of the Hill reference further reinforced the idea that this was a consensus view within the industry, not an outlier opinion. What made the industry solidarity particularly significant was what it revealed about the creative values that professional comedy writers shared. Despite their very different approaches to animation, The Simpsons, South Park, and King of the Hill all agreed on certain fundamental principles. Stories should have coherent narratives. Jokes should grow out of character and situation. Comedy should aspire to say something, even if that something is simple. These weren't revolutionary ideas. They were the basic building blocks of comedy writing that had been established over centuries of theater, literature, and filmmaking. Family Guy's radical departure from these principles had created a rift in the animation community precisely because it threatened to undermine the craft itself. The Simpsons had their own complicated history with Family Guy that predated the Cartoon Wars solidarity moment. Many Simpsons writers had long believed that Family Guy was essentially a derivative of their show, borrowing heavily from its suburban family premise, pop culture reference humor, and boundary-pushing content while stripping away the emotional core and narrative discipline that made The Simpsons work. The rivalry between the two Fox shows had been simmering for years, with Simpsons writers making occasional jabs at Family Guy in their episodes. But those jabs were usually subtle and easy to miss. South Park's cartoon wars was anything but subtle, and the fact that Simpsons writers celebrated it suggests they had been waiting for someone to say loudly what they had been muttering privately. King of the Hill's involvement was perhaps the most telling because Mike Judge's show occupied a very different creative space than either South Park or The Simpsons. King of the Hill was a deliberately understated show that drew its humor from realistic characters and situations rather than surrealism or shock value. Hank Hill didn't go on wacky adventures or encounter supernatural phenomena. He grilled burgers, worried about his lawn, and tried to understand a world that was changing faster than he could keep up with. The comedy was quiet, character-driven, and deeply rooted in the specificity of small-town Texas life. Every joke on King of the Hill grew organically from who these people were and how they saw the world. The fact that even King of the Hill's writers, who operated in a completely different comedic register, shared the same criticism of Family Guy underscored that the issue wasn't about comedic taste or style preferences. It was about professional standards. You could prefer broad comedy or subtle comedy, crude humor or sophisticated humor, and still agree that jokes should serve a story and characters should drive the narrative. Family Guy's rejection of those principles offended writers across the entire spectrum of animated comedy. The Simpsons' response deserves special attention because of the complicated history between those two shows. The Simpsons had been on the air since 1989, and by 2006, it was already deep into what many fans consider its own decline period. The show's golden age, generally considered to span seasons 3 through 8, was long past, and later seasons were increasingly criticized for many of the same problems that would eventually plague Family Guy: weaker storylines, more reliance on celebrity guest stars, and jokes that prioritized spectacle over character. But even The Simpsons at its weakest maintained a commitment to narrative coherence that Family Guy never possessed. A weak Simpsons episode still told a story with a beginning, middle, and end. A weak Family Guy episode was just a collection of gags loosely organized around a premise that nobody, including the writers, seemed particularly invested in. The resentment from the Simpsons camp was fueled by what many writers perceived as creative theft. Family Guy's premise, a bumbling patriarch, a patient but long-suffering wife, a rebellious son, a neglected daughter, and a baby with surprising intelligence, bore an unmistakable resemblance to the Simpson family template. MacFarlane's Rhode Island setting, his suburban domestic comedy framework, and even specific character dynamics seemed to echo The Simpsons in ways that went beyond mere coincidence. The Simpsons had built something original and revolutionary, and they felt that Family Guy had taken that template and dumbed it down, removing the emotional depth and replacing it with randomness. South Park's cartoon wars gave Simpsons writers a public-facing champion for grievances they'd been nursing privately for years. There's an irony in The Simpsons writers celebrating South Park's takedown of Family Guy, because South Park had also parodied The Simpsons, though with considerably more affection. The season 6 episode Simpsons Already Did It acknowledged the shadow that The Simpsons cast over all animated comedy, with Butters discovering that every scheme he dreamed up had already been done on The Simpsons. But the tone of that episode was reverence, not contempt. Parker and Stone grew up watching The Simpsons and considered it one of the great achievements of American television. Their criticism of Family Guy was sharpened by their love for The Simpsons, because they saw Family Guy as a degradation of something they cherished. Critics and academics later noted that the Cartoon Wars episodes represented something rare in television, a show using its own format to make a serious argument about the nature of its art form. South Park wasn't just mocking Family Guy for entertainment. It was engaging in genuine criticism, the kind of thoughtful analysis that usually only appears in film school lectures or literary journals. But by embedding that criticism in an entertaining, well-crafted episode of television, Parker and Stone made their argument accessible to millions of viewers who would never pick up a book about comedy theory. They democratized the debate about what makes good comedy, and they did it while being very, very funny. Now, it's worth spending some time on how Seth MacFarlane and the Family Guy team responded to all of this, because their reaction tells you a lot about the dynamics of the feud and whether it was ever truly a two-sided conflict. Because here's the thing about the South Park versus Family Guy rivalry that most people get wrong: it was never really a rivalry at all. It was an extended critique by one party and a series of confused, sometimes gracious, sometimes defensive responses by the other. MacFarlane's initial response to Cartoon Wars was surprisingly positive. He publicly called the episodes funny and accurate, which is a remarkably generous thing to say about a show that just compared your writing staff to mindless marine mammals. When he spoke at Harvard University's Class Day in June 2006, just 2 months after Cartoon Wars aired, he addressed the criticism in character as Stewie Griffin, turning the whole thing into a comedy moment rather than engaging with it as a serious creative disagreement. This was a smart move from a PR perspective because it made MacFarlane look like a good sport while avoiding the need to actually defend his show's creative choices. But MacFarlane's graciousness had limits. In a 2012 interview with Rolling Stone, he was asked about the ongoing criticism from Parker and Stone, and his response was more revealing. He said that the Family Guy crowd and the Simpsons crowd had become friendly over time, suggesting that whatever tension existed between those two shows had been resolved. But the South Park creators were a different story. MacFarlane said he thought the South Park episode making fun of Family Guy was funny and accurate, repeating his earlier praise. But then he added something significant. He said he didn't understand the personal venom that Parker and Stone spewed in the press about the show and about him, noting that it wasn't in the context of a joke. He called it baffling and said it would be interesting to know where it came from because he didn't know them personally. This is fascinating for several reasons. First, MacFarlane was drawing a distinction between creative criticism delivered through comedy, which he could appreciate and even respect, and personal attacks delivered through interviews, which he found hurtful and confusing. He was essentially saying that the manatee metaphor was fair game, but calling his writers lazy in a magazine article crossed a line. And he had a point. There's a meaningful difference between crafting a satirical episode that critiques another show's creative philosophy and telling Howard Stern that the other show's writers need to work harder. The former is art. The latter is just talking trash. MacFarlane was particularly upset about comments Parker and Stone had made about his writing staff. In an interview on The Howard Stern Show, MacFarlane acknowledged that the 2-part Cartoon Wars episode was very funny. But he said that reading interviews where Parker and Stone were really just spitting venom at his staff crossed a line for him. His position was clear: go after the show all you want, go after him personally if you must, but don't pick on writers who are making much less money than Parker and Stone and who can't defend themselves publicly. This was a reasonable complaint, and it humanized the conflict in a way that the cartoon parodies never could. Real people with real careers were being publicly mocked by two of the most influential voices in animation, and those people had no platform to respond. The Family Guy writers themselves handled the criticism with more humor than their boss did. In DVD commentaries after Cartoon Wars aired, the writers began referring to their own gags as manatee jokes, turning South Park's insult into an inside joke. This self-deprecating response was arguably the best possible way to handle the situation because it acknowledged the criticism without being defensive about it and showed that they could laugh at themselves. The only significant creative retaliation from Family Guy came 3 years later, in the 2009 episode Spies Reminiscent of Us. In this episode, Peter Griffin and Glenn Quagmire attend an improved comedy show where Peter's random, disconnected gags get huge laughs from the audience while Quagmire's more structured, character-based humor falls flat. The implication was clear: South Park might think their approach to comedy is superior, but audiences prefer Family Guy's style. It was a decent attempt at a counter-argument, but it suffered from a fatal flaw. The episode had to rig the scenario to make Peter's gags funnier than Quagmire's structured comedy, which only worked within the universe of Family Guy itself. In the real world, the question of which approach produced better comedy could be answered by comparing actual episodes of both shows, and that comparison wasn't kind to Family Guy. What's notable about the Family Guy response is what didn't happen. MacFarlane reportedly considered a more direct attack on Parker and Stone. A joke was written for the season 6 episode McStroke that would have shown Parker and Stone at a location called Anal Point, but it was ultimately cut because MacFarlane decided it was in poor taste. This restraint is telling. MacFarlane understood that escalating the feud would only draw more attention to South Park's criticism and force him to defend Family Guy's creative choices in a public forum where he might not come out on top. Better to take the high road, call the parody funny and accurate, and let the ratings speak for themselves. There was also a reported incident involving Britney Spears, who was apparently a huge fan of Family Guy and demanded that MacFarlane create an episode mocking South Park after Parker and Stone had ridiculed her in their episode Britney's New Look. MacFarlane refused, reportedly saying he didn't want to start a feud. This is ironic because the feud already existed, but it shows that MacFarlane was consistently trying to de-escalate while Parker and Stone continued to press the attack. There's also a dimension to this story that often gets overlooked, which is MacFarlane's own relationship with Family Guy and how it changed over time. Ironically, MacFarlane himself has only written 3 episodes of Family Guy across the show's entire run: Death Has a Shadow, the pilot episode, Family Guy Viewer Mail 1, and North by North Quahog, the season 4 premiere that kicked off the post-revival era. That's it. 3 episodes out of well over 400. MacFarlane's primary role on Family Guy has always been as a voice actor rather than a writer, and as the show continued, he became increasingly focused on other creative projects. He developed The Orville, a live-action science fiction series that allowed him to tell the kind of long-form, character-driven stories that Family Guy's format never could. He hosted the Oscars. He made films like Ted and A Million Ways to Die in the West. He produced the Naked Gun remake. Each of these projects represented MacFarlane moving further away from the random gag comedy that Family Guy was known for and toward more traditional narrative storytelling. It's hard not to read MacFarlane's creative trajectory as a quiet acknowledgement that South Park was right. The man who became famous for cutaway gags spent the second half of his career trying to prove he could do more than cutaway gags. The Orville in particular feels like MacFarlane's answer to the criticism that he couldn't tell a real story, and it's telling that the show was generally well received by audiences and critics who appreciated its earnest, character-focused approach to science fiction. MacFarlane didn't just move beyond Family Guy's creative limitations. He actively sought out projects that demonstrated the exact qualities Parker and Stone had accused him of lacking: narrative depth, character development, and emotional sincerity. Years later, in a 2025 appearance on the Town podcast, MacFarlane offered his most generous comments about South Park yet. When asked about South Park's viral season 27 premiere that had skewered Donald Trump with extraordinary timeliness, MacFarlane expressed genuine admiration. He said he would never trade his animation team for anything on Family Guy, but that South Park's production cycle of roughly 2 weeks was incredible. He praised the show further, noting that any show lasting that long was astounding, and acknowledged that Family Guy's 10-month production cycle made it nearly impossible to match South Park's topicality. This felt like a moment of genuine respect, an acknowledgement that whatever his personal feelings about Parker and Stone's attacks on his show, what they had built with South Park was genuinely remarkable. The asymmetry of the feud is important to understand because it reflects the deeper creative asymmetry between the two shows. Parker and Stone were always the aggressors because they had a specific argument to make about the nature of comedy, and they believed that argument passionately. MacFarlane was always on the defensive because he didn't share their view that there was anything wrong with his approach to comedy. He genuinely believed that cutaway gags were a legitimate and valuable form of humor, that making people laugh was enough regardless of whether the jokes served a narrative purpose. And from a commercial standpoint, he had the ratings to back up that belief. But commerce and craft are different things, and the passage of time would reveal which approach had more staying power. One of the most interesting things MacFarlane ever said about the feud came during the Howard Stern interview, when he compared his encounters with Parker and Stone to the way Churchill and Hitler were cordial in face-to-face meetings during World War II. It was obviously a joke, but the choice of comparison was revealing. MacFarlane was casting himself as Churchill, the underdog being attacked by an aggressive force, while Parker and Stone were Hitler, the aggressors pushing their ideology on others. It's a wildly disproportionate comparison for a disagreement about cartoon comedy, but it suggests how personally MacFarlane took the criticism even as he tried to brush it off publicly. So what actually happened to Family Guy after Cartoon Wars? Because that's the real question here. South Park made some bold predictions about the trajectory of Family Guy's comedy, and nearly 20 years later, we can evaluate those predictions against reality. And the verdict is overwhelming. Everything Parker and Stone warned about didn't just come true. It came true in ways that were worse than even they probably imagined. The decline of Family Guy is one of the most thoroughly documented falls in television history, and it follows a trajectory that South Park's criticism mapped out with almost prophetic accuracy. The central prediction was simple: a comedy built on disconnected gags rather than story and character will eventually run out of gas because random humor has a shelf life. When the novelty of the randomness wears off, there's nothing underneath to sustain the audience's interest. No character depth to explore. No ongoing narratives to follow. No emotional investment to maintain. Just an ever-increasing need for bigger, louder, more outrageous gags to keep people's attention. The early signs of decline appeared around Season 8, which premiered in 2009, roughly 3 years after Cartoon Wars aired. This is the period that most fans and critics point to as the beginning of the end, though the show continued to have occasional strong episodes for several more seasons. What changed in Season 8 wasn't immediately obvious. The voice cast was still excellent. The animation quality hadn't dropped. The show was still capable of producing clever gags. But something fundamental had shifted in the writing. The cutaway gags, which had once been used sparingly and effectively in the early seasons, became increasingly dominant and increasingly disconnected from whatever story was happening. Entire scenes were derailed by rapid-fire sequences of cutaways, many of which recycled jokes or referenced pop culture that was already dated. This is exactly what South Park predicted with the manatee metaphor. When your comedy is generated through random combinations of pop culture references, you eventually burn through all the interesting combinations. The manatees run out of fresh ball pairings, so they start pulling the same balls in slightly different orders. The result is jokes that feel familiar even when you haven't heard them before, because they follow the same structural pattern of "remember this thing?" Now imagine it in this context. After hundreds of episodes, the pattern becomes the joke, and the pattern isn't funny anymore. By Season 10, the problem had become impossible to ignore. Critics who had once praised Family Guy's inventiveness were now using words like formulaic, repetitive, and lazy to describe the show. The cutaway gags had gone from being the show's signature to being its crutch. Writers were using them not as a creative choice but as a way to fill time when they didn't have enough story to sustain an episode. A 22-minute episode might contain 8 to 10 minutes of cutaway gags, effectively reducing the actual story to little more than a framework for delivering disconnected jokes. The clothesline metaphor that industry insiders had used to describe Family Guy, using the plot as a clothesline to hang jokes on, had become darkly literal. The clothesline was sagging under the weight of too many jokes, and nobody was bothering to make sure the clothes were clean. The creative team seemed aware of the problem but unable or unwilling to fix it. The show began experimenting with longer, more sustained joke sequences, including extended musical numbers and drawn-out physical comedy bits that lasted several minutes. The most infamous of these was the recurring Conway Twitty gag, where the show would cut away from the action to play an entire Conway Twitty musical performance. These segments lasted anywhere from 30 seconds to over a minute of screen time, which is an eternity in a 22-minute comedy. Fans were divided. Some thought the Twitty gags were brilliantly anti-comedic, a knowing subversion of the audience's expectations. Others saw them for what they were, padding. When your show is so desperate for content that you're airing archival footage of a deceased country singer to kill time, something has gone very wrong with your creative process. The creative problems were compounded by a staffing situation that would have been alarming at any other show. Family Guy operated with around 14 writers and a budget of roughly $2 million per episode, which by television standards is extremely generous. The show had the resources to produce excellent comedy. It had a large enough writing staff to generate abundant material. And it had a voice cast that remained consistently excellent throughout the show's entire run, with MacFarlane himself delivering remarkable performances across multiple characters. The raw ingredients for a great show were always there. What was missing was the ambition and the discipline to use those ingredients properly. The contrast with South Park's writing process is stark and illuminating. South Park's writing staff was much smaller, with Parker himself writing the vast majority of episodes either solo or with minimal collaboration. The show's budget, while healthy, was modest compared to Family Guy's. And the production timeline left essentially no room for rewrites or second guesses. Everything about South Park's process was leaner, more constrained, and theoretically more likely to produce mediocre results. But the constraints forced creativity in a way that Family Guy's abundance never did. When you have 14 writers and 10 months, it's easy to coast. When you have one primary writer and 6 days, every creative decision matters and there's no time to be lazy. Industry observers have pointed to Family Guy's writers' room culture as another factor in the show's decline. As original writers who had been with the show since its debut or its revival departed and were replaced by newer writers, the institutional knowledge of what had made the show work in the first place gradually eroded. New writers who had grown up watching Family Guy understandably imitated the show's most visible elements, which were the cutaway gags and the shock humor. But they often missed the character work and the narrative discipline that had made the early seasons function. They copied the surface without understanding the structure, and the result was a show that looked like Family Guy and sounded like Family Guy but felt increasingly hollow. The problem extended beyond individual gags to the show's overall relationship with its audience. In the early seasons, Family Guy's humor, while edgy, had a playful quality to it. The show seemed to be in on the joke, inviting the audience to laugh along at the absurdity of the world. But as the seasons wore on, the humor became increasingly mean-spirited and cruel, as if the writers were trying to provoke a reaction from an audience that had become desensitized to the usual provocations. Shock value became the primary currency, and when one shocking joke stopped working, the next one had to be even more extreme. This is the inevitable endpoint of comedy without a narrative or emotional anchor. When your jokes don't serve a story, the only way to keep them interesting is to keep escalating. An escalation without purpose eventually becomes cruelty for its own sake. The writing quality deteriorated in ways that were measurable as well as subjective. The show's massive writing staff, which numbered around 14 writers with a multi-million-dollar budget, produced episodes that felt increasingly generic and interchangeable. You could swap the B-plot from one episode into a completely different episode and nobody would notice, because the stories were so thin and the characters so one-dimensional that nothing depended on anything else. This is the logical consequence of the Manatee philosophy. If your comedy is modular, your stories are modular too. And modular stories are disposable stories that leave no lasting impression. Nowhere was Family Guy's decline more visible than in what happened to its characters. The term Flanderization, named after Ned Flanders from The Simpsons, describes the process by which a fictional character's personality is gradually reduced to one or two exaggerated traits until the character becomes a caricature of their former self. Family Guy didn't just experience Flanderization. It became the definitive example of the phenomenon, the show that other shows are compared to when discussing how badly a cast of characters can deteriorate. Peter Griffin's transformation is perhaps the most dramatic and depressing character assassination in animation history. In the early seasons, roughly seasons 1 through 3, Peter was a lovable, dim-witted father who meant well despite his obvious limitations. He was essentially a cruder version of Homer Simpson, a bumbling dad who made mistakes but genuinely loved his family and tried to do the right thing, even if he usually failed. His stupidity was endearing rather than malicious. When he did something dumb, it was because he was too dense to know better, not because he wanted to cause harm. You could root for Peter because despite everything, his heart was in the right place. After the show's revival in 2005, Peter began a gradual transformation that accelerated dramatically around season 8. His stupidity went from bumbling dad to clinically impaired. His selfishness went from thoughtless to actively malicious. His treatment of his family went from careless to outright abusive. By the show's later seasons, Peter had become something genuinely uncomfortable to watch. He would physically assault his daughter Meg for no reason. He would cheat on his wife Lois repeatedly and without remorse. He would endanger his children's lives for petty amusement. He would destroy property, commit crimes, and traumatize strangers, all without consequence and often with the show presenting his behavior as comedy. The shift from lovable idiot to psychopathic manchild wasn't just character development gone wrong. It was a symptom of the larger creative problem that South Park had identified. When your comedy doesn't depend on character depth, your characters are free to become whatever the joke of the week requires them to be. One episode might need Peter to be a caring father, so he's a caring father. The next episode might need him to be a violent sociopath, so he's a violent sociopath. There's no continuity because there's no investment in who these people are as people. They're just delivery mechanisms for gags, and the gags have gotten darker and crueler, so the characters have had to become darker and crueler to deliver them. Brian Griffin's Flanderization is equally devastating and arguably more frustrating because he had the most potential for genuine character depth. In the early seasons, Brian was the show's voice of reason, a snarky but genuinely intelligent dog who served as Peter's conscience and the audience's surrogate. He was well-read, thoughtful, and capable of genuine emotional depth. His running gag of being a frustrated writer added a layer of relatable pathos that made him one of the most beloved characters on the show. After the revival, Brian was gradually transformed into an insufferable, hypocritical pseudo-intellectual. His liberal political views went from a character trait to a preachy soapbox. His literary ambitions went from sympathetic to pretentious. His romantic relationships went from unlucky in love to predatory. He became the writer's mouthpiece for whatever political message they wanted to deliver, and then he became the writer's punching bag when they wanted to mock that same political message. The result was a character who felt like he was written by two different teams who hated each other, one using Brian to lecture the audience and the other using Brian to mock the audience for listening. The most extreme example of the show's disregard for its own characters came in season 12 with the episode Life of Brian, in which Brian was killed off by being hit by a car. His death scene was played with genuine emotion, the family grieved, and a new character named Vinny was introduced as his replacement. The internet exploded with outrage. Fans organized petitions demanding Brian's return. And 3 episodes later, Stewie traveled back in time and saved Brian, undoing his death entirely. The whole thing was widely perceived as a ratings stunt, a cynical manipulation of the audience's emotional investment in a character that the writers had already spent years undermining. It perfectly encapsulated the show's broken relationship with its own creations: kill a beloved character for shock value, generate buzz, reverse the death for more buzz, and pretend nothing happened. Meg Griffin's treatment might be the most disturbing example of Family Guy's creative bankruptcy because it took something that started as a harmless running gag and turned it into something genuinely mean-spirited and uncomfortable. In the early seasons, Meg was a typical teenage girl who was occasionally embarrassed by her weird family. She wasn't especially interesting, but she was a relatable enough character who served as a grounding presence. The jokes about her being lame or uncool were gentle and no worse than what any teenager might experience. By the later seasons, Meg had become the family's designated punching bag in ways that went far beyond comedy into something that looked a lot like abuse. Her own father would physically attack her, shoot at her, and publicly humiliate her. Her mother would express open contempt for her existence. Her siblings would participate in the cruelty. And the show's response to criticisms of this treatment was perhaps the most troubling moment in its entire run. In the season 10 episode Seahorse Seashell Party, Meg finally stands up to her family and calls them out for their abuse. For a moment, it seems like the show is going to address the problem and give Meg some dignity. But then Brian explains that Meg serves as the family's lightning rod, absorbing all their negativity so they can function as a unit. Meg accepts this role and apologizes to her family for standing up for herself. The message of that episode, whether intentional or not, was that victims of abuse should accept their suffering because it serves the greater good of the people abusing them. It was presented as a comedic resolution, but the underlying logic was genuinely toxic. Stay in the abusive relationship. Don't rock the boat. Your pain is necessary for other people's comfort. It's hard to imagine a more perfect example of what happens when comedy operates without a moral compass, when the joke is the only priority and the implications of that joke are never considered. Other characters suffered similar fates. Quagmire, who started as a relatively harmless womanizer with a 1950s swinger vibe, was gradually revealed to be a full-blown sexual predator whose behavior was played for laughs even as it became increasingly criminal. Early Quagmire was charming in a sleazy way, the kind of neighborhood character who made inappropriate comments but was ultimately harmless. Later, Quagmire was a statutory rapist, a peeping Tom, and someone whose behavior would put him on a registry in the real world. The show seemed unable to decide whether Quagmire was supposed to be lovable or monstrous, so it tried to be both simultaneously, creating a character who was genuinely disturbing to watch. Joe Swanson, who was initially portrayed as a competent and admirable police officer who happened to use a wheelchair, became a crutch for cruel disability humor and a cowardly, spineless cop who let Peter get away with everything. Early Joe was inspiring. He was proof that a disability didn't define a person, that you could be a wheelchair user and still be the toughest, most capable person in the room. Later, Joe was a punchline. His wheelchair was the joke. His disability was the setup and the payoff. The show stripped away everything that made him interesting and reduced him to the single trait that was easiest to mock. Cleveland Brown's Flanderization led him off the show entirely when he was given his own spin-off, The Cleveland Show, which ran from 2009 to 2013. But even that spin-off couldn't resist the gravity of lazy writing, and Cleveland was transformed from a kind, well-meaning guy into essentially a black version of Peter Griffin, loud, stupid, and constantly making poor decisions. When he returned to Family Guy after the Cleveland Show's cancellation, he was barely recognizable as the gentle, thoughtful character he'd been in the early seasons. Stewie Griffin's transformation deserves its own discussion because it represents a missed opportunity on a massive scale. In the early seasons, Stewie was one of the most original characters in animated comedy, a diabolical infant genius who spoke with a British accent, harbored plans for world domination, and had an elaborate, often violent rivalry with his mother Lois. The contrast between his sophisticated speech patterns and his status as a baby was inherently funny, and the show mined that contrast brilliantly. His evil plans were absurd and creative, and his relationship with the rest of the family, none of whom seemed to take his villainy seriously, generated genuine comedy. Over time, the writers decided they had exhausted the evil baby premise and gradually transformed Stewie into Brian's effeminate, culturally sophisticated sidekick. The Road to episodes, which paired Brian and Stewie on adventures that parodied classic films, were among the show's most popular and best-reviewed episodes, so the writers leaned harder and harder into the Brian-Stewie dynamic at the expense of Stewie's original characterization. By the later seasons, Stewie was essentially a completely different character who happened to share a name and voice with the original. His world domination schemes disappeared. His rivalry with Lois evaporated. His most prominent trait became a vaguely defined sexuality that the show alternately played for gentle humor and offensive stereotypes depending on the episode. The tragedy of Stewie's Flanderization is that it actually could have been a positive evolution if it had been handled with care and intentionality. A character growing and changing over time is not inherently a bad thing, and the idea of Stewie slowly moving away from villainy and toward genuine emotional connection with Brian had real potential. But Family Guy didn't execute this change as a character arc. It executed it as a convenience, switching Stewie's personality when the old version stopped generating easy jokes and replacing it with a new version that generated different easy jokes. There was no transitional period, no internal conflict, no moment of reckoning. One day he was an evil genius, and then gradually, over many episodes, he wasn't anymore. The change happened to serve the show's need for content, not the character's need for development. This is what South Park meant when they said Family Guy's writers needed to work harder. Character development is hard. Maintaining consistency while still allowing characters to grow and change is hard. Finding humor in who characters are rather than in what random situations you throw them into is hard. It's much easier to Flanderize, to reduce each character to their simplest possible version and then repeat the same joke about that simple version forever. Peter is dumb. Brian is pretentious. Meg is ugly. Quagmire is perverted. These aren't characters anymore. They're punchline templates. And when your cast is nothing but punchline templates, there's nothing for the audience to invest in emotionally, which means there's no reason to keep watching except for the gags. And as we've already established, the gags have a shelf life. There's a broader pattern here that connects Family Guy's character problems to its comedy problems, and it's all rooted in the same fundamental issue that South Park identified. When comedy doesn't serve a story, it doesn't need characters. When it doesn't need characters, characters become expendable. When characters become expendable, the show loses its emotional core. When the show loses its emotional core, the only thing left to escalate is the shock value. And when shock value becomes the primary tool, cruelty becomes the default mode because cruelty is the easiest form of shock to produce. You don't need talent or insight to be cruel. You just need a willingness to hurt fictional people for laughs. The mean-spiritedness of later Family Guy is impossible to overstate. The show went from being edgy and provocative to being genuinely unpleasant to watch. The Meg abuse is the most visible example, but it extends to virtually every character and every situation. Peter doesn't just make mistakes anymore, he deliberately causes suffering and enjoys it. The cutaway gags don't just reference pop culture, they depict graphic violence, degradation, and humiliation for their own sake. There's a difference between dark comedy and cruel comedy, and the line is drawn by purpose. Dark comedy uses darkness to illuminate something, to make an audience confront uncomfortable truths about the world. Cruel comedy uses darkness because darkness gets a reaction, and getting a reaction is the only goal. To understand the scale of the shift, consider what Family Guy's violence looked like in Season 2 versus Season 15. In the early seasons, violence was cartoonish and consequence-free in the way that all animated comedy violence has been since Looney Tunes. Peter might get hurt, but he'd bounce back immediately, and the joke was in the slapstick timing rather than the suffering. By the later seasons, violence had become graphic and lingering. Characters would bleed profusely. Bones would protrude through skin. Injuries would be depicted with what the show itself sometimes called hyperrealistic detail. The show seemed to take pleasure in making the audience uncomfortable, not because the discomfort served a comedic or narrative purpose, but because discomfort was the closest thing to genuine engagement that the show could still produce. The Turban Cowboy incident perfectly illustrated how far the show had drifted from responsible comedy. A 2013 episode contained a cutaway gag showing Peter mowing down runners at the Boston Marathon with his car. About a month later, the actual Boston Marathon bombing occurred, killing 3 people and injuring hundreds. The episode was pulled from streaming platforms and Fox stated they had no immediate plans to rebroadcast it. The gag had no satirical point, no commentary on violence or terrorism. It was just a random cutaway showing a character committing mass murder at a real, recognizable event, played for laughs because nothing in Family Guy's comedy requires a reason to exist. The Conway Twitty gags, the interminable Peter versus chicken fights, the extended sequences of Peter clutching his knee and wincing in pain for 45 seconds, these weren't innovative comedy techniques. They were the show running out the clock, killing time because it had nothing meaningful to say and no story worth telling. When early Family Guy did extended physical comedy, like the knee-clutching gag, it worked because it subverted the audience's expectation of how long a joke should last. The first time you saw Peter hold his knee for 30 seconds, it went from funny to unfunny to funny again through sheer commitment to the bit. But by the 10th or 20th time the show pulled the same trick, the subversion had become the expectation, and there was nothing left to subvert. The joke was dead, but the show kept performing CPR on it episode after episode. The Saran Wrap bit, the chicken fights that grew longer and more destructive with each iteration, the full-length Conway Twitty performances that consumed over a minute of precious screen time, these weren't comedy choices. They were admissions of defeat. When you fill a significant portion of your episode with footage of a dead country singer performing a song, you are telling your audience that you couldn't think of enough actual jokes to fill 22 minutes. And the audience noticed. Forum discussions and Reddit threads from the show's later seasons are filled with fans expressing frustration at what they perceived as padding and laziness, using almost exactly the same language that Parker and Stone had used years earlier. Critics have also pointed to the show's treatment of sensitive topics as evidence of creative bankruptcy. Family Guy has always pushed boundaries, and in its early seasons, the boundary pushing had a rebellious energy that felt fresh and exciting. But as the show wore on, the boundary pushing became increasingly indiscriminate and purposeless. Jokes about school shootings, suicide, domestic violence, pedophilia, and racial stereotypes weren't deployed in service of satire or social commentary. They were deployed for the sake of being outrageous, as if merely mentioning a taboo subject was enough to qualify as comedy. The delivery was flat, the context was absent, and the result was humor that felt less like a comedy show and more like a playground bully seeing how many people he could upset. The Parents Television Council named Family Guy the worst TV show of the week on over 40 separate occasions, filed numerous complaints with the FCC, and published multiple reports criticizing the show's content. While the PTC's pearl-clutching often missed the point of edgy comedy, their persistent criticism of later Family Guy wasn't entirely wrong. There's a difference between pushing boundaries with purpose and pushing boundaries because you've forgotten how to be funny any other way. The early seasons pushed boundaries. The later seasons just pushed. Perhaps the most damning evidence of Family Guy's decline is how the show itself eventually acknowledged the problem. In the 2019 episode Trump Guy, Peter Griffin directly addresses the camera and says the show is trying to phase out gay jokes. Executive producers Alex Sulkin and Rich Apple confirmed this shift, stating they wanted the show to better reflect the current cultural climate. This was essentially an admission that the show's approach to comedy, which had been defended for decades as equal opportunity offense, was outdated and needed to change. If the manatee's philosophy of everything is fair game and nothing is sacred was still working, why would the show need to start censoring itself? This wasn't an isolated moment of self-reflection either. The show has increasingly engaged in meta-commentary about its own shortcomings, with characters occasionally breaking the fourth wall to acknowledge that a joke went too far or that the show's humor has changed over the years. In one episode, Peter mentions that Family Guy has survived 19 cancellations, 2 assassination attempts, and a pretty good ribbing by those South Park guys, directly referencing the Cartoon Wars criticism as a significant moment in the show's history. These acknowledgements would be more meaningful if they led to actual creative improvement, but they rarely do. The show recognizes its problems, winks at the audience about them, and then continues doing exactly the same things it was doing before. It's self-awareness without self-improvement, which might be the most Family Guy response possible to genuine criticism. The show's 2024 move to Comedy Central, the same network that airs South Park, created an especially ironic situation. After nearly 2 decades of rivalry, the two shows were suddenly sharing a network, airing on the same channel that Parker and Stone had used to deliver their most devastating criticisms. The juxtaposition of South Park episodes and Family Guy reruns on the same network schedule was like placing a master class and a cautionary tale side by side and letting the audience draw their own conclusions. Even Family Guy's attempts to course-correct have reinforced South Park's original criticism rather than undermining it. When the show introduced more serialized elements in certain seasons, trying to build longer character arcs and ongoing storylines, the results were uneven at best because the show's fundamental architecture wasn't designed for that kind of storytelling. You can't graft narrative depth onto a framework built for random gags any more than you can turn a variety show into a novel by connecting the sketches with a loose plot thread. The structural DNA of Family Guy is modularity, and modularity is the enemy of sustained storytelling. Every time the show tried to be something it wasn't, the experiment either collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions or was abandoned after a few episodes in favor of the familiar gag and cutaway formula. The answer, of course, is that the manatee's philosophy was never really about artistic freedom or comedic principle. It was about taking the path of least resistance. Random jokes about random targets are easy to produce and require no creative risk. But when cultural attitudes shift and certain targets become less socially acceptable, the random approach breaks down because removing even one category of targets from the pool means the manatees have fewer balls to work with. The show's decision to phase out certain types of jokes revealed what South Park had been saying all along: Family Guy's comedy was never principled. It was just lazy. It was the path of least resistance dressed up as creative freedom, and when external pressures forced the show to change course, the emptiness of that philosophy was exposed for everyone to see. Now, here's where the comparison with South Park becomes truly illuminating, because while Family Guy was experiencing this long, slow decline, South Park was doing something remarkable. It was evolving, growing, finding new creative territory to explore. And it was doing all of this while staying true to the fundamental principles that Parker and Stone had championed in Cartoon Wars. Every joke serves the story. Every story says something about the world. Characters matter. Consequences exist. The comedy and the commentary are inseparable. South Park's production process has always been its secret weapon, and it's worth understanding just how different it is from every other animated show on television. Most animated shows take 6 to 10 months to produce a single episode. Family Guy's production cycle runs about 10 months from start to finish. The Simpsons is similar. This means that by the time an episode airs, the cultural moment that inspired it may have already passed. A Family Guy episode written in February about something that happened in January won't air until the following November, by which point nobody remembers or cares about the original event. South Park operates on a completely different timeline. Parker and Stone produce each episode in roughly 6 days, sometimes less, using their custom-built animation software and a relatively small production team. This means that something can happen in the news on Monday and South Park can have a fully produced, finished episode commenting on it airing by Wednesday. This isn't just impressive as a production achievement. It fundamentally changes what the show can be and what it can do. South Park isn't just an animated comedy. It's animated commentary, responding to the world in something close to real time. This speed matters because it forces Parker and Stone to make creative decisions under pressure, which paradoxically produces better work. When you have 10 months to write a script, it's easy to overthink it, to second-guess yourself, to add unnecessary elements and lose sight of your original point. When you have 6 days, every creative decision has to be instinctive and purposeful. There's no time for tangents or filler. Every joke has to earn its place because there's no room for jokes that don't contribute to the episode's central argument. The tight deadline is a creative constraint that functions as a quality filter, stripping away everything that isn't essential and leaving only the strongest material. The result is a show that has remained culturally relevant for nearly 3 decades, an almost unprecedented achievement in television. South Park premiered in 1997, and as of its most recent seasons, it's still producing episodes that generate national conversation. The season 27 premiere in 2025 depicted Donald Trump in a way that was so timely and so devastating that it went viral almost instantly, drawing praise even from competitors like MacFarlane. The show's ability to comment on the present moment, to capture the absurdity and hypocrisy of current events while they're still happening, gives it a vitality that no other animated show can match. But speed and topicality aren't enough to explain South Park's endurance. What keeps the show relevant is the same thing that made Cartoon Wars so effective: Parker and Stone genuinely care about storytelling. Every episode of South Park, no matter how crude or outrageous, has a narrative spine that holds it together. Characters face situations, make choices, deal with consequences, and sometimes learn lessons, though the lessons are often cynical or nihilistic. The comedy grows out of the characters' responses to the world, not from random tangents disconnected from the action. South Park's characters have also evolved in ways that Family Guy's never did. Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny are recognizably the same people they were in 1997, but they've deepened and complicated over time. Cartman's villainy has become more nuanced and psychologically complex. Kyle's moral certainty has been tested and sometimes found wanting. Stan's cynicism has expanded into something approaching genuine depression. Randy Marsh has gone from a minor character to arguably the show's most dynamic and entertaining figure, evolving through multiple reinventions while maintaining a consistent core personality. These developments didn't happen accidentally. They happened because Parker and Stone invested in their characters as characters, not just as joke delivery systems. Randy's evolution is particularly worth examining because it illustrates everything that Family Guy got wrong about character development. In the early seasons, Randy was just Stan's dad, a geologist who occasionally panicked about whatever crisis was affecting South Park. He was funny, but he was a supporting player. Over time, Parker and Stone recognized the comedic potential in Randy's combination of enthusiasm, poor judgment, and desperate desire to be relevant, and they gradually expanded his role. By the later seasons, Randy had become the show's secret weapon, a middle-aged man going through a perpetual midlife crisis that manifested in increasingly absurd ways. His marijuana farming venture in the Tegrity Farm storyline, his wannabe rock star fantasies, his constant need to be at the center of whatever cultural trend was sweeping through South Park, all of these were funny because they grew organically from who Randy was as a person. The key is that Randy never lost his essential Randiness even as his role expanded. He was still the same guy who overreacted to everything, who made terrible decisions with complete confidence, who loved his family but was too self-absorbed to put them first consistently. The comedy evolved because the character evolved, and the character evolved because the writers cared enough to develop him over time rather than just finding one funny trait and hammering it into the ground. Compare this to Peter Griffin, who started as a lovable idiot and became a psychopathic man-child not because the character grew into that role, but because the writers needed increasingly extreme behavior to generate jokes. The show has also been willing to take genuine creative risks that Family Guy never attempted. The serialized storylines of seasons 18 through 20, the pandemic special and subsequent specials that dealt with real-world events, the shift toward longer-form storytelling in the streaming movies for Paramount Plus, all of these represented Parker and Stone pushing their show into new territory while maintaining the satirical edge that defined it. Not every experiment succeeded. Some fans felt the serialized seasons were too focused on continuity at the expense of standalone comedy. But the willingness to experiment, to risk failure in pursuit of growth, is exactly the kind of creative ambition that separates South Park from Family Guy. South Park's approach to satire also evolved in ways that Family Guy's never did. In its early seasons, South Park's satire was often broad and scattershot, mocking easy targets like celebrities and consumer culture. As the show matured, its satire became more focused and more incisive, targeting specific ideas and systems rather than individual people. Episodes about social media, political polarization, gentrification, cryptocurrency, streaming culture, and artificial intelligence demonstrated a level of cultural awareness and analytical depth that would be unimaginable from Family Guy. Parker and Stone weren't just making fun of things. They were dissecting them, showing how systems of power and culture operate and fail, often arriving at insights that were genuinely thought-provoking. Consider some specific examples. The Season 17 Black Friday trilogy took on the commercialization of holiday shopping and the tribal warfare of console gaming communities simultaneously, filtering both through an extended Game of Thrones parody that was both structurally ambitious and hilarious. The Season 19 exploration of gentrification through the character of C.T. Partown and the Whole Food storyline showed how economic forces transform communities in ways that everyone claims to oppose but nobody actually resists. The pandemic special of 2020, produced during actual lockdowns, managed to capture the absurdity, frustration, and genuine danger of the COVID-19 era in real time, something no other animated show even attempted. The Fish Sticks episode from Season 13 remains one of the most effective celebrity satires in television history, taking a simple joke about fish sticks and using it to dissect Kanye West's relationship with his own ego, his inability to accept that he might be wrong about anything, and the sycophantic culture that enables celebrities to lose all perspective. The joke isn't that Kanye is stupid. The joke is that genius in one area can coexist with breathtaking blindness in another, and that fame creates an echo chamber that makes self-awareness nearly impossible. Make Love, Not Warcraft used an entirely different animation style, partnering with Blizzard Entertainment to create World of Warcraft machinima sequences, to tell a story about gaming addiction that was simultaneously the funniest thing they'd ever done and a genuinely accurate depiction of how online gaming can consume your life. The boys' physical deterioration as they spend weeks grinding away at a virtual enemy was funny because it was recognizable. Every gamer watching that episode could see a version of themselves in those increasingly unhealthy, increasingly pale kids sitting in front of their computers, and the laughter came from a place of uncomfortable self-recognition, not from random pop culture references. Trapped in the Closet took on Scientology with a level of factual detail that most investigative journalists hadn't achieved, laying out the actual beliefs of the Church of Scientology while running a disclaimer at the bottom of the screen that read, "This is what Scientologists actually believe." The episode was so effective that it led to real-world consequences. Isaac Hayes, the beloved voice of Chef and a practicing Scientologist, left the show. Tom Cruise reportedly pressured Paramount to pull the episode from rotation. And the episode introduced millions of viewers to information about Scientology that the church had spent decades trying to suppress. This is what satire is supposed to do. Not just get laughs, but change how people understand the world. None of these episodes could have been produced by manatees pulling balls out of a tank. Each one required specific knowledge, careful construction, and a genuine point of view about its subject matter. Each one told a complete story with developed characters making choices that had consequences. And each one used comedy not as an end in itself, but as a vehicle for insight. This is the difference that Parker and Stone were talking about in Cartoon Wars, and these episodes are the proof of concept. The key difference between South Park's satire and Family Guy's attempts at social commentary is intentionality. When South Park tackles a topic, every element of the episode is designed to illuminate that topic from multiple angles. The characters' reactions reveal different perspectives. The plot developments expose contradictions and hypocrisies. Even the crude humor serves a purpose, often deflating the pomposity of the topic being discussed. When Family Guy tackles a topic, the topic is usually just a backdrop for the same cutaway gags and character abuse that appear in every other episode. The commentary is surface level because going deeper would require the kind of sustained narrative focus that the show's structure doesn't support. So where does this leave us after nearly 2 decades of watching these two shows evolve in opposite directions? The verdict, I think, is clear, and it's the verdict that South Park was arguing for back in 2006. Comedy that serves a story endures. Comedy that replaces a story expires. Family Guy proved this by declining in almost exactly the ways that South Park predicted. The cutaway gags became stale. The characters became hollow. The humor became cruel. And the audience, slowly but surely, began to lose interest, even as the show continued to air new episodes on autopilot. Let's talk about the numbers for a moment, because the ratings tell their own story. Family Guy peaked in its post-revival period around seasons 4 through 7, when it was regularly drawing 8 to 10 million viewers per episode. By season 15, those numbers had dropped to around 3 to 4 million. By season 20, the show was averaging under 2 million viewers for many episodes. The decline wasn't sudden or dramatic enough to get the show cancelled, but it was steady and relentless, a slow bleed of viewers who had once been enthusiastic fans and had gradually lost interest. South Park experienced ratings fluctuations too, but its cultural impact remained consistently high, with individual episodes breaking through into the mainstream conversation in ways that Family Guy hadn't managed in years. The critical reception tells a similar story. Family Guy's early seasons were praised by critics for their inventiveness and energy. The post-revival seasons received mixed but generally positive reviews. But by the show's teens, critical reception had turned decisively negative. The show's Metacritic and Rotten Tomatoes scores for individual seasons show a clear downward trajectory, with later seasons receiving some of the harshest reviews in the history of animated television. Terms like creative bankruptcy, mean-spirited, and unwatchables appeared with increasing frequency in professional reviews, and the consensus among critics shifted from flawed but entertaining to fundamentally broken. South Park, by contrast, maintained a remarkably consistent level of critical respect throughout its entire run. Not every season was equally praised, and some experimental choices were divisive, but the show was never written off by critics the way Family Guy was. The reason is simple: even when South Park misfired, it was clearly trying to do something ambitious. A failed South Park episode was still recognizably attempting to comment on something real, to tell a coherent story, to make a point. A failed Family Guy episode was just a collection of jokes that didn't land, and without any narrative or thematic spine, there was nothing to salvage from the wreckage. The cultural legacy of both shows reinforces the verdict. South Park has entered the lexicon of American culture in ways that few television shows ever achieve. Phrases and concepts from the show have become common shorthand for real-world phenomena. "Respect my authority" became a catchphrase for anyone mocking petty authoritarianism. "They took our jobs" became the default way to parody xenophobic rhetoric about immigration. The entire concept of member berries, from the show's 20th season, became a widely used term for the kind of nostalgia-driven media that avoids engaging with the present by retreating into comfortable memories of the past. These phrases entered the culture because they described something real, something that people recognized and needed language for. Family Guy's cultural contributions are more difficult to identify because its comedy was never anchored to specific ideas or observations. The show produced some iconic moments, certainly. Peter fighting the giant chicken, the Conway Twitty gags, the various celebrity impressions. But these are memorable as isolated bits rather than as expressions of a larger idea. They don't describe anything about the world. They don't give people new ways to talk about their experiences. They're entertainment that exists in the moment and then disappears, which is exactly what you'd expect from comedy generated by manatees pulling random balls out of a tank. Perhaps the most telling comparison between the two shows' legacies is how they influenced the next generation of animated comedy. South Park's influence can be seen in shows like BoJack Horseman, which combined animated comedy with genuine emotional depth and serialized storytelling. It can be seen in the production philosophy of shows that prioritize topicality and cultural relevance. It can be seen in the broader trend toward animated comedy that treats its audience as intelligent adults capable of engaging with complex ideas. South Park proved that animated comedy could be both crude and smart, both funny and meaningful, and a whole generation of creators took that lesson to heart. Family Guy's influence, by contrast, can be seen in the proliferation of cutaway-heavy, plot-light animated comedies that flooded the market in the 2000s and 2010s, most of which are already forgotten. Shows that prioritized random humor over story, shock value over character, and volume over quality. Some of these shows found temporary audiences, but almost none of them have endured because they were built on the same fundamentally unsustainable creative model that Family Guy pioneered. When your comedy is random, there's no signature. When there's no signature, there's nothing to remember. And when there's nothing to remember, there's no legacy. South Park proved the same thesis from the other side by demonstrating that story-driven comedy can remain vital and relevant decade after decade. The show isn't perfect, and Parker and Stone would be the first to admit that. Not every episode is a masterpiece. Some of their experiments have fallen flat. Their libertarian-leaning both sides are equally ridiculous philosophy sometimes produces episodes that feel smug or dismissive. But even at its worst, South Park is trying to say something. It's engaging with the world. It's taking creative risks. It's treating its audience as people who deserve more than just random pop culture references strung together on a clothesline. The irony of the whole situation is that MacFarlane himself essentially admitted South Park was right, even if he'd never phrase it that way. His acknowledgement that Family Guy's 10-month production cycle makes it nearly impossible to be topical, his praise of South Park's creative agility, his tacit admission that the show needed to change its approach to certain types of humor, all of these are concessions to the argument that Parker and Stone were making back in 2006. Comedy that doesn't adapt dies. Comedy that doesn't invest in story and character eventually runs out of material. Comedy that treats its audience as passive consumers of random stimulation will eventually lose that audience to something more nourishing. The ultimate proof that South Park was right about Family Guy isn't found in critical scores or ratings numbers, though both have trended in South Park's favor over the past decade. It's found in cultural impact. When people discuss the greatest animated comedies of all time, South Park is always part of the conversation along with The Simpsons. Family Guy is increasingly mentioned as a cautionary tale, a show that had enormous potential and squandered it through creative laziness and a refusal to evolve. Parker and Stone saw this coming in 2006. They saw it because they understood something fundamental about comedy that MacFarlane either didn't understand or didn't care about. Comedy isn't just about making people laugh. It's about making people care. When the laughter stops, the caring is what keeps the audience coming back. And when you've never given them anything to care about, they leave and they don't come back. The manatees were never the problem. The problem was that manatees were all there was. No story. No characters. No purpose. Just balls bouncing around in a tank, generating random combinations that got a laugh the first time and a groan the 500th time. South Park warned us this would happen. And they were right. About all of it. What makes this story particularly relevant right now is the parallels between Family Guy's creative model and the broader state of entertainment in the social media age. We live in a world increasingly dominated by content that operates on Family Guy principles, short, disconnected, algorithmically generated or optimized, designed for maximum immediate engagement with zero concern for lasting impact. TikTok videos, Twitter threads, Instagram reels, these are the manatees of modern media, pulling random balls out of a tank and generating content that gets a reaction in the moment and is forgotten 30 seconds later. The same forces that made Family Guy's cutaway format seem revolutionary in 2005 have now metastasized into an entire media ecosystem built on randomness and disposability. South Park's warning about Family Guy was, in retrospect, a warning about something much bigger than one cartoon show. It was a warning about what happens to culture when we stop demanding that our entertainment tell us something, mean something, connect to something larger than itself. Family Guy didn't decline because Seth MacFarlane is a bad writer or because his staff is untalented. It declined because the creative philosophy it was built on is inherently self-limiting. Randomness has a shelf life. Shock has a tolerance curve. Cruelty has a diminishing return. And when all of those things wear out, there's nothing left underneath to sustain you. Story never wears out. Characters never run out of potential. The human desire to see someone face a challenge, make a choice, and deal with the consequences is as old as language itself, and no amount of technological change or cultural shift will make it obsolete. South Park understood that in 1997, articulated it in 2006, and continues to prove it today. Family Guy learned it the hard way, through a slow, painful decline that transformed one of the most popular shows on television into a cautionary tale about creative shortcuts. The final irony is this: the Cartoon Wars episodes are now among the 5 South Park episodes that have been removed from streaming platforms, not because of their criticism of Family Guy, but because of their depiction of Muhammad. The censorship that Parker and Stone were fighting against in 2006 ultimately won, at least on that particular front. But the creative argument they made in those episodes, the argument about story versus gags, about purpose versus randomness, about craft versus convenience, that argument has been vindicated so thoroughly that even the target of their criticism has tacitly acknowledged it. When Seth MacFarlane praises South Park's production process, when Family Guy announces it's phasing out certain types of jokes, when the show's own fan base longs for the quality of the early seasons, they are all saying the same thing that Parker and Stone said in 2006. Just in different words. And with considerably less courage. If you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next video. We've got a lot more content coming about South Park, Family Guy, The Simpsons, and all your favorite animated shows. Drop a comment below telling us whether you think South Park was right about Family Guy or if you think the criticism went too far. Do you think Family Guy still has good episodes, or has the decline been as bad as we've described? We love hearing from you guys and reading your perspectives in the comments. Until next time, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.